Yeah, it's always my pleasure to introduce the speakers, but doubly so tonight because, as I say, I've known Peter for close to 50 years because we were students together at the University of Waterloo back in the 70s when we first both got into archaeology. So I can definitely directly attest to the fact that he did his honors BA at the University of Waterloo and graduated in 1976. We were in the same graduating class. Peter went on to do his master's degree and his doctorate in anthropology at the University of Toronto at that time. He then went on to do postdocs, a Shirk postdoc, first at the University of Waterloo, and then he went on to the University of Auckland to do a postdoc there, and then of course ended up on the faculty at the University of Auckland, where he's just retired. So I guess he's a professor emeritus, if they use that term there, from the department in Professor of Archaeology at Auckland. He's the former head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Auckland. So I guess that's sort of like a deanship, I would guess, somewhat similar to that, but he can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Pete's early work when he was in Ontario was with paleomaterial. He was one of the people who first set out to try and find the source of the fossil hill Collingwood chert. And he found a bunch of secondary deposits, which it turned out were in the fields right beside where the outcrops ended up being found on that back in the 70s. And he also did, when he was at U of T, did some work on documenting the use of heat treatment to improve the flaking qualities of Paleo-Indian artifacts used on material from the Park Hill site in Ontario. And that was published in American Antiquity. However, once he got to Auckland, and for the last 35 years, he's worked on in the archaeology of the Pacific Islands, both in New Zealand, and particularly for the last 35 years, certainly, actually longer he's worked there, but for the last 35 years in the Solomon Islands. And in fact, he recently in 2017 published the book as a co-author of the book called The Archaeology of the Solomon Islands, which was published by the University of Hawaii Press. Peter has a long and distinguished record of publications. I think he's published like 26 articles just in the last 7 years that I was able to find a list of. He's published in all the major journals, whether it's Current Anthropology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, of course, and the Journal of the Polynesian Society and Archaeology in Oceania, which are two of the major journals for the archaeology of the Pacific. And Peter's now, even currently, is the co-editor of Archaeology in Oceania, that journal. On there. So he's published a large number of papers, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce him tonight to talk about Vikings of the Sunrise, the peopling of remote Oceania. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to my long good friend, Peter Sheppard.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll start with saying hello. In New Zealand, Maori will say to you, kia ora. If we move, do you see my cursor at all?
Yep.
Yeah, if you move a little bit to the north and east to the Cook Islands, they'll say kia orana. In fact, they just opened up a travel bubble between New Zealand and Cook Islands this morning, which makes the people in Cook Islands happy because they're suffering pretty badly from the tourism. But anyhow, move up further into the Society Islands and Tahiti, he would say Io Orana. And so you can see relationships between those words, those greetings. And then the Marquesas, they would say Kaoha, and then up in Hawaii, Aloha. And so you can see maybe some relationship there. Something's going on down through here. There's some history represented by these similarities and differences. And then we come back into central, or what we call Western Polynesia. And if you go to the island of Samoa, they'll say Talofa. And if you go then a little bit south to Tonga, they'll say Maloelele. Again, there's some considerable difference between what we're seeing here. And then you move over to Fiji and they'll say Bula. And so there's quite a bit of difference here. And from a linguistics point of view, you might think that that's representing time, but it's certainly representing historical differerences. Then I have a problem with this approach when I move over here into island Melanesia. You can barely see, here's New Caledonia, here's the islands of Vanuatu up in here, Solomon Islands going up in there. And suddenly out here, we have sort of one language per archipelago. But suddenly I get over here to Vanuatu, I've suddenly got 128 languages in Vanuatu alone. large numbers also in New Caledonia. Up in the Solomon Islands, maybe 80, depends on how many have gone extinct lately. And then, of course, we moved over to Papua New Guinea, and we've got many, many hundreds. So huge linguistic diversity. That's also telling you something about history. And so here's in Roviana Lagoon, where I've spent quite a bit of time in the 90s, they would say to you, Lianahola. Now, there's some similarities and differences, but these are all members of the great Austronesian language family, which extends from New Zealand, Easter Island, Hawaii, up to Taiwan, down through the island, Southeast Asia, and then over to Madagascar and along the coast of PNG. Within PNG itself, there's the Papuan languages, of which there are many, many hundreds. But most of this world is an Austronesian world. And although you see differences in these greetings, one of the things is with kia ora, you can say kia ora when you see someone, you say kia ora when they might say something in a speech that you really appreciated. And you say kia ora when they're finished, because it's not so much like hello, it's more like good day. You could say good day when you greet someone and good day when you leave them, and it means essentially a state of goodness or of health or of proper relationships. And so here, this word, this greeting over in Roviana, Liana Hola Liana means good, and Hola means very good. So Liana Hola, I can say that when I greet you and when we leave. So there's a lot of history indicated by these, but also a lot of commonality. And so what archaeology is trying to do is to understand that diversity and that deep history. Now, in the 18th century, when explorers came out here, they quite quickly realized that there was a lot of linguistic similarities here and that there was sort of a shared history. So Captain Cook, when he got to Society Islands over in here, picked up a man by the name of Tupaya, who was an important person in his area, but also quite a scholar, a Tahitian scholar. When he brought him down to New Zealand, he could communicate with people here in New Zealand. And so, although there's language difference, there's a great similarity throughout this area. So even in the 18th century, Europeans understood that there was some similarities here that needed to be understood, similarities and differences. Now, in the 18th century, the French described this whole region as Polynesia, many islands. But it was Captain Dumont d'Urville, who was a French naval captain and then subsequently admiral and cartographer, who coined the terms by which we sort of split up this world today. And so we have Polynesia, this area in through here, West Polynesia, anthropologists would talk about in here, Micronesia up here, mostly above the equator, up in this area, small islands, a lot of atolls, tiny little atolls, and then over here, Melanesia. These are the dark islands. And what that relates to in part is the recognition that although there's a linguistic similarity, there's also sort of biological differences, obviously biological differences. And so out here amongst Polynesia, and it was represented in sort of racial terms in that time. So here we see a picture of Captain Wallace being greeted by the Queen of Tahiti, a very aristocratic sort of setting. And over here we see Captain Cook firing on natives in Eromanga. And so these people are much darker skinned, shorter. These people are presented as sort of tall, aristocratic sort of people. And so, but there was, they could see biological differences as well. And that also ultimately needed to be explained. Now, if you want to talk about settlement of the Pacific, the first thing you have to worry about is the fact that we're, it's a movement across an ocean, which can be a bridge, but also a barrier if you know what you're doing, or a bridge if you know what you're doing, a barrier if you don't. And the most fundamental thing is that winds tend to blow from the east to the west. So if you're trying to settle out into this area, you're going to sail upwind. And so one of the things that tells us, of course, that A, they did it, so that therefore they must have had good sailing vessels and had good navigational skills. The other thing, of course, if you can beat up against the wind, my good friend and colleague, Professor Jeff Irwin, has always said, well, actually, that was a helpful sort of situation, because if you wanted to come back home, as long as you could maintain your latitude, the wind would push you back home again. So this is the winds, which I captured back on an image I captured back on the 4th of January this year. And so you can see the winds, it would be pretty hard to make any headway out that way. Though you could possibly get blown from, say, Cook Islands down into New Zealand, that might be useful. The other thing important to notice, at this time of year, the winds are blowing up from along the Solomon Islands and blowing down from, say, above the equator, above Micronesia, along here. So if you want to come that direction during our southern summer, then the winds are blowing that way, but they reverse come our southern winter. And so if you want to go back and forth here, you just have to be patient and wait your season, and you get winds which help with the movement along here. As we'll see, that's an important consideration. Back that week, we had this remnants of the cyclone here off of the Queensland coast, which made the surfers all happy. But today, of course, we have a cyclone which is developing just about here. It's supposed to, if we're lucky, it'll track down here, but it looks like it might track down through here. So we're just holding our breath to see what happens in a couple of days' time. But anyhow, these are the fundamental sort of physical conditions which people trying to settle into this part of the world had to deal with. Now, as I said, back in the 18th and then in the 19th century, the early, explorers and missionaries and all the rest of it, and early anthropologists developed some good ideas about what happened with the settlement of the Pacific. But it wasn't until 1938 when Peter Buck published Vikings of the Sunrise, from which I take my title. And this was becoming published multiple times, became very popular in North America and around the world in terms of explaining the settlement of this particular area. Sir Peter Buck was Maori. His Maori name is Te Rangi Hiroa. He was a medical doctor, then became a New Zealand politician, then went to the First World War, was second in command of the Maori battalion at Gallipoli and also on the Western Front. And then he came back, and as you do, decided to become an anthropologist. And I mean, he was, very interested through his grandparents in his Maori heritage and, studying what was going on in the Pacific. So working initially with the Bishop Museum, he was able to have a sort of postdoc at the time of 5 years and do a lot of study in the Pacific. And then eventually, of course, he became the director of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, one of the longest serving director, I think. But anyhow, in 1938, he proposed this model, which you see in front of you, that there was a southern route by which food plants and domestic animals came along to the south, and that's sort of like through the Solomon Islands, perhaps, and through Vanuatu and across to Fiji. And then for the Polynesians, or the East Polynesian in particular, the movement was a northern route, sort of from Micronesia across the top of what we see today as Polynesia, and then ultimately into places like the Marquesas and Hawaii, and then on down ultimately to places like New Zealand. And so he had this dual model, which, as we'll see, from this point on, I mean, people spent a lot of time sort of poo-pooing this idea, but as we'll see, it's probably the current idea in 2021, like once more, we'll see. Now, archaeology, of course, Father Otto Meyer, who was a French Jesuit missionary, established a mission on this tiny little, so here we are up in Bismarck Archipelago. This is Papua New Guinea over here. And so in the equator is, up here somewhere. He established a mission on this tiny little island you see off the end of New Britain, Wattom Island. And there he found sherds of very distinctive, highly decorated pottery, which didn't look like anything you could see around at that time, being made by people at that time, 1909. But anyhow, he, as a good Jesuit scholar, he sent stuff back to Paris, and it was put in the Musée de l'Homme, and people just forgot about it. But here's an example of this Lapita, what eventually became called Lapita pottery, very carinated pots, very elaborate. And there's all kinds of, there's pedestals, there's flat-bottomed dishes, just very elaborate ceramics. So nothing much happened until that time, until about 1950, when a French geologist working on the Ile de Pan, which is a little island off the end of New Caledonia down here, Avias, discovered similar kinds of pottery. And I don't really understand why, but somehow he knew about the material. He had seen the material in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and recognized a relationship. And almost at the same time, just a few years later, we get Edward Gifford and Richard Shuttler. Now, Edward Gifford established the Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley, and he had as his student and then as his assistant, Richard Shuttler, who many of you might know, went on to become an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe Chris took some courses from him. He was quite a fellow. But Shuttler and Gifford, Gifford had done archaeology, and he was an anthropologist, but he'd done archaeology in Fiji and various other places. And in 1952, he came with Richard Shuttler to New Caledonia to do work there. He brought with him his Richard's wife, Mary Shuttler, and apparently the only reason that she was allowed to come was that she was the only one who spoke French. And so, as often is the case, the success of this whole expedition depended upon the good graces of the archaeologist's wife. I mean, she was an archaeologist as well. So I put her picture up there instead of Richard Shuttler. Now, at about 1951 or about the same time, Jack Golson from Cambridge University was sent out to the colonies, to New Zealand, to establish academic archaeology at the University of Auckland. I mean, there have been archaeologists in the various museums in New Zealand for, considerable period of time then, at least 50 years, but none in the academic institutions. And so Jack Golson brought sort of a British methodology to archaeology here. And immediately he went out and did work in New Zealand, but also throughout the Pacific and Samoa and various other places, including Tonga. And in 1961, he basically said, well, this ceramic is the same throughout this entire region, and from New Britain and Papua New Guinea all the way down through New Caledonia and on out to Tonga. And therefore, there's this community of culture which exists out there. And so the Lapita is some kind of early community of culture which came out into the Pacific. So the site that they excavated that Gifford and Shuttler excavated in New Caledonia, they labeled their, numbered the site. So site 13A, they asked the people there, what's the name of that site, what that place? And they said something like Zapeta, which they translated as Lapita. Of course, today we know that what that means is the place where you're digging. So anyhow, the archaeological culture got named Lapita after the supposed name of the location where it's found. And you can see my good friends Christophe Sand and Jacques Boulet from the Institute of Archaeology in Noumea excavating some of these huge Lapita pots from the site 13A, re-excavating back in the 90s. Some people from Auckland went to help with that excavation, which was originally, as I said, excavated in 1952. So we have this Lapita culture established. As I said, very elaborate ceramic and carinated pots, dentate stamping. This particular design is called a labyrinth motif. And today, the known Lapita sites extend from the Bismarck Archipelago, where they are the earliest ones. The earliest dates are found up here in New Britain, in this region up in here, and extended down here. And there's some that we've recovered in this part of the world. None here, as we'll see, that's very important. Then out here in what we call remote Oceania. So archaeologists have divided this world, and linguists for that matter, have divided it along this barrier here because there's 400 kilometers across there, open ocean. Prior to that, you could pretty much see the next island all the way on back, along here, up into island Southeast Asia, all the way back into the mainland. But this was the first huge water gap. And it's not until, so people were living here in the Pleistocene. We have sites up here that are 29,000 years old, but they didn't get past here until about 3,000 years ago. And so they call this near Oceania, settled in the Pleistocene, and remote Oceania, settled after 3,000 years ago. The furthest east, though, that we see sites is Samoa. And here there's only one known, and it's underwater, and it's called the Ferry Burst site because it was during excavation to deepen the ferry port on the island of Savaii. They found Lapita pottery. But since then, despite many of my colleagues working really hard in Samoa, they haven't found any of that time period. And so people were able to sail out here, but then they stopped, which is an interesting question. So why stop here? This is a sailing canoe. You know, I don't know. We don't know what they used, but something perhaps similar to this, though maybe bigger, which is a tapuki, or a sailing canoe from the Reef Santa Cruz region, which people have used up. Well, you can still see them today. Now, this movement into remote Oceania is, pretty fundamental to the settlement of the Pacific. And so my old professor, Roger Green from the University of Auckland, who employed me as a postdoc in 1988, went with his good friend, Douglas Yen from the University of Hawaii, created what he called the Southeast Solomons Culture History Project, in which he studied both sides of this divide, in the main Solomon Islands and then out in the Reef Santa Cruz Islands. And in the Reef Santa Cruz, he found all kinds of Lapita sites. Here you can see in the Reef Islands, and down here, here's the SZ8 site, which we'll talk about a little bit. And he confirmed the dates. Now, today I date this around 3,000 calibrated BP as the earliest movement out. Roger, of course, when he was doing his work, the errors on the dates were, maybe a couple hundred years. And this important site, this what seems to be a very early site here, he couldn't get any charcoal from. So, as I said, very distinctive pottery. This is a very famous one. If you look at any textbooks which talk about the Pacific, you'll probably see this particular illustration of this face design from the Nanumbo or RF2 site in the Reef Islands, which dates somewhere a little bit after 3,000 calibrated BP. You can see the dentate stamping, the anthropomorphic image, the face design, which you find in many different forms in Lapita pottery. People, of course, consider this to be ancestors, and perhaps the pottery, this elaborately decorated pottery, not particularly well made, actually, but elaborately decorated, may well have related in part to some kind of ancestor cult, but of course we don't know. So here's Roger Green's excavation at that Nangu site, the SZ8 site on Santa Cruz in 1976. So here you can see in the south coast of Santa Cruz, the location of SZ8. There's a lagoon system here, which you can't really see through clouds. We'll look at that a little bit more. So the settlement model around 1979, I chose 1979 because in 1979, there was a book edited by Jesse Jennings, of all people, on Pacific archaeology. And Roger published an article called Lapita, which he was sort of defining what we knew about Lapita and the early settlement at that time. And this was the model at that time. These people are Austronesian speakers. The earliest Austronesian speakers were apparently the Aboriginal people of Taiwan. You can see them here. They speak Austronesian, and the idea was that people must have moved rapidly or slowly, and that was quite a debate, down through this region into this area. Lapita was formed because you can't find Lapita pottery out here. Of course, you can find ceramic out here, and it's one of those situations where people are always saying, look, this pot looks pretty Lapita. And you say, yeah, just hold it in the right light and it looks like Lapita. And so it's always a bit of debate, but the real fancy Lapita only appears here. And then at that time, they're arguing about 3200 BP. It moves out into remote Oceania, into Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, or Tonga, Samoa, and all within a few hundred years, actually, very short. I mean, radiocarbon terms, it's very difficult to distinguish, make differences between the time of first settlement out through here. And then they stopped. And at that point, the argument was that East Polynesia wasn't settled until around 1700 BP, although they didn't really know. They like it to be old, for reasons which we might have time to discuss. But that was the model then. And so here, but of course, one of the questions was, so here we have these people, these are the chiefs of Nangu village on Santa Cruz Island, which I took in 2014, I think. And here's some Polynesian people from out here. And so how do we account for this kind of difference as well, even though they're all speaking Austronesian languages? So how to explain the genetic and cultural difference between island Melanesia and Polynesia? Well, the idea then was that there were two migrations, which, with the development of processual archaeology, any kind of model which relied on migration was sort of a bit suspect. And of course, it seemed like a pretty special kind of circumstance to have two separate migrations. Like, why? You can see the first people, there was no one out there, the first migration. So you're going to uncharted lands where the fish are leaping out into your boats. But the second, why would the second migration occur? And then the other question was, why stop for almost 2,000 years in West Polynesia? I mean, they were able to sail all the way out there. Why didn't they keep going? Why didn't they get to New Zealand then, or Hawaii, or perhaps just the Southern Cooks? And then, of course, how exactly do we derive East from West Polynesia? Because there were reasons why Peter Buck didn't derive East Polynesians from West Polynesia, because culturally, and to some extent even linguistically, it's a difficult ask. There's just so much difference. There's so huge similarity amongst all of East Polynesian cultures, but that had to happen somewhere, and you cannot see the origins of it in West Polynesia necessarily. It was always a bit of a question, and that's why Peter Buck had his model, which had Polynesians sort of coming out of Micronesia. So the question then was, let's explore this model and see what's going on. And so in 1988, I was working in Jordan, and I was finished my PhD, and I was applying to all kinds of things, and I got various offers. But one of the offers I got when I showed up in Amman was a telegraph from Roger Green saying, you know, I'd applied for a postdoc out in New Zealand. I thought that New Zealand sounds good. It'll be like white sand beaches, palm trees. You know, Canadians always think going south is good, not thinking that eventually it starts to get cold again. But anyhow, and I heard about Lapita once, but I did have some background in sourcing and also in lithic analysis, and that's what Roger wanted. And so, because in these Lapita sites out here that he found out here, he found obsidian. There's no obsidian here. He found very good quality chert. There's no chert here. And so what are the sources of these? Well, obsidian at that time, we know from geology, of course, that you need rhyolitic volcanism. And so up here in New Britain and Talasea Peninsula, we've got obsidian, tons of obsidian, and there's various sources up here. And so it seems reasonable that the obsidian was coming from here down to here. And the chert, well, there's limestone, islands with lots of marine limestones in this region up here. So perhaps that's where the chert is coming from. So I got off the plane in 1988, and almost immediately Roger sent me to the Solomon Islands. I mean, and so, you know, he said, we're going to do some sourcing on the obsidian. We know basically where it comes from, but the chert, we need to have more samples. So he sent me to the island of Malaita. I should have mentioned with the obsidian, one of the interesting things with the obsidian is, if you look at these Lapita sites here, and you can see the numbers of pieces of obsidian. So here's sources, these stars are source areas. These sites up here have quite a bit. We come down into the Solomons, and this is more recent work of mine showing there's not much there. But Reef Santa Cruz, those sites, and here's the earliest one, quite a few pieces. Although you have to sort of control for area and all the rest. But once you get out in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, here's the site with the most, 53 pieces. New Caledonia, 4 pieces, 2 pieces. Fiji, 4 pieces. Tonga and Samoa, 0. So there's a bit of a puzzle here, you know, the amounts coming here. And if you make estimates, I mean, I estimated, I forget how much I estimated that are found at all of the sites in Reef Santa Cruz, but Jim Specht estimated maybe as much as 1,000 kilos in 20 sites. So a lot of material here. And also my lithic analysis indicated that there wasn't much evidence of reuse. And it seemed to me from my analysis that it's, you know, hard to derive what we see is from an initial amount brought out and then subsequently passed down, reworked, and so on. It looked like people were going back and forth for some time from the source all the way into the Reef Santa Cruz. Anyhow, Roger sent me up to the Solomons in 1989. Never been out in the Pacific before. And I had to go from here is Honiara, capital of Solomon Islands, over here in Guadalcanal. I had to go up here to Auki, the capital of Malaita, because that's where we thought perhaps the chert, this region is geologically looked like a good spot. Here you can see the quality of that kind of chert. So I spent a long wet night on the deck of this boat going across, sleeping on a pile of rice sacks. And as the water sort of flowed across the deck, the cockroaches kept climbing higher and higher. And, yeah, I didn't get hardly any sleep. The next morning I wake up, I walk up from the dock up to the bank of this little village of Auki, and the bank was made of chert. The rocks used to make the walls were chert. I mean, it quite rapidly became apparent to me that the idea of finding the source, I mean, everywhere you looked in Malaita, and I did survey down along this coastline here, but every river is just full of chert. The whole, you know, it's marine limestone here. And by looking at the foraminifera within the cherts, the archaeological cherts out there in Reef Santa Cruz, I was able to make a linkage to the material up here. Certainly it's from the same geological time period. It looks the same and so on. Here's a woman it was a wonderful experience for me because, here's a woman using a pump drill with a stone tip drill to drill shell beads. She wasn't particularly good at it, but her mother came eventually and showed her how to do it properly. This really is sort of a Gary Larson moment because they're just doing this for the tourists. For me, the tourist me. And in Honiara, of course, most of the shell money is made with electric drills these days, but even in 1989. But anyhow, so established that there was chert coming from this region out to the Reef Santa Cruz, and that obsidian was coming from the Bismarck Archipelago and New Britain region. Now, other thing so I started looking into the culture history of this region and linguistics of this region. And what you rapidly find is here there is a historic ceramic tradition. In 1970, people were still making clay pots on Choiseul. And so there's plainware, a ceramic tradition which lasts right into the historic period. Down here, there is no historic ceramic tradition. And there aren't even words for clay pots in the languages down here. There's also major linguistic differences here. These are languages, many languages here, 27 languages in this region alone, are Northwest Solomonic family. Down here, the Southeast Solomonic family. And there's a major divide here, which correlates with this archaeological or this material culture difference as well. And that difference is, the linguists say, like the difference, say, between French and German. Here, people can hear their neighboring language. They always say, yes, I can hear that language. They can't hear languages across that boundary. So major linguistic, but also, it's a historical division somehow, something happening here. Ceramics here, no ceramics there. So in 1989, when I was finished surveying on Malaita and coming back with bags and bags of chert, I went to the Western Solomons, where I met up with my good friend Kenneth Roga, who was at that time the Cultural Affairs Officer in the Western Province of the Solomon Islands. And he showed me some ceramics that he'd had been found in a lagoon in the Western Solomons. And so I kept remembering that material. And starting in 1995 is the first year I went up, and starting in 1996, I started looking for Lapita sites, essentially, but for all archaeology, because there's been virtually no archaeology done in any of these islands. So it was all new territory, so anything you found was of interest. And so in this chain of islands, and gradually over the years, we worked our way along through many of these different islands. I mean, you can see everything there from lots of World War II material right back through into this ceramic period. And so first I went to this Rogiana Lagoon. And the pottery that my friend Kenneth Roga showed me came from a site which is just right about here. There's a passage, right here. A passage which goes out from the lagoon and here out into the open sea. And right on the edge of that passage, there was ceramics found in intertidal situation. So we went there, and this man, this elder, dead now, of course, Silas Oka, his house was just adjacent to this area where the ceramic came from, and he was quite happy to show us where this material was. And there is where this ceramic site is. At low water time, which is in the middle, in about August, you can easily see ceramics on the surface here. And so for quite a period of years, we surveyed throughout Rogiana Lagoon, but then eventually working further and further into more lagoon systems throughout the Western Solomons, finding more and more sites. And this is the sort of pottery we found. Now, some of them, very small amount of potsherds from some of the sites had the dentate stamping and the carinated pot forms, the elaborate pot forms. But most of them were this incised kind of wears an applique. And all Lapita pottery at any time period has lots of incised material. So what we see here is a very late sort of Lapita expression which we know we can trace now all the way back up into New Ireland in the Bismarck Archipelago. And these are intertidal sites. We know from other sites up in the Bismarck Archipelago that Lapita, early Lapita, many of the sites are intertidal. They're stilt villages like this one here. And this is northern Bella Lavella. In actual fact, there is an intertidal site just in behind these houses here in the mangroves back in here. But, Lapita often is found in intertidal situations, stilt village situations. Dating, of course, intertidal sites. I mean, there's no stratigraphy. Dating them is extremely difficult. I mean, we can date them in a stylistic sense, but getting carbon dates out of them is hard. And we managed to get some inclusions that we could date. And, they seem pretty reasonable. Of course, the problem with dating material within a ceramic body is that maybe it was there in the original clay body. We did get some dates which came out, obviously dating the clay body itself, the original source, but we're happy. These make sense, the dates that we got. And since then, so here you can see lots of little dots indicating all the intertidal sites in Rodiana Lagoon. And since then, we've found a lot more in Bella Lavella, here in Columbangra, down here, everywhere we look down in the lagoon system here, over on Santa Isabel here, up into Choiseul along here. There's at least 37 of these intertidal sites, late Lapita sites recorded from this region. Now, given our archaeological experience, and this was with my, from 1996, I involved my good colleague, Richard Walter from the University of Ottawa in this research. And then many PhD students, I should say, and MA students, and a lot of work to come out of, postgraduate work to come out of this. But based on our archaeological experience, but also on the available linguistic and genetic data at that time in 2006, we proposed the model of a leapfrog movement out of the Bismarck Archipelago directly into the Reef Santa Cruz and not through here. And what we're saying is there's a later movement, maybe 2,700 years or 2,600 into here. Doesn't go in here. At that time, there was no, there was no evidence of ceramic in here, except for a small amount, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so this leapfrog of Lapita out here, that would account for the huge amounts of obsidian here, hardly anything here coming from this source. And then there's a rapid fall off in the amount of obsidian out here. Well, my good friends and colleagues, Matthew Spriggs and many other people at the time just said, well, Peter, you just have to try harder, and then they'd always chant to me, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, which I always wondered, then what would be the evidence of absence? How long do you keep looking for something when you're not finding it, when it's actually not there? Anyhow, they said, oh, well, there's got to be more Lapita, earlier Lapita there somewhere. In the Eastern Solomons, there must be Lapita. So I said, well, now I'm going to move from the Western Solomons to work in the Eastern Solomons. And the first place I went to was this. So here's Guadalcanal in the capital again. And so we were here in the West, now we've moved east. I went to this tiny little island of Santa Ana off the end of this island, which actually Google Earth should get their act together. This is, Solomon Islanders call this Maquira. This is the old Spanish name, but that's been changed to Maquira. But anyhow, so Santa Ana just off of here. And so we know that there was a bit of ceramic there. 1966, the famous anthropologist William Davenport from University of Pennsylvania had gone out there and basically emptied some rock shelters. Those were the days when anthropologists did archaeology. So he just sort of emptied the entire thing. But he found some very small samples of very friable plain pottery, not the fancy Lapita decorated stuff. And this pottery, I'm sure if I showed it to you, you would say, now, are you actually sure that's really pottery? Because it's like pottery made by people who don't know what they're doing. But anyhow, Roger Green then went out subsequently as part of his project and looked again and found a bit more of it and got some dates, but the dates had errors of a couple hundred years on. So it was pretty hard to tell exactly how old this stuff was. And so I thought I'd go back there and try to find more and try and redate this stuff. And so we went and did some work at a rock shelter here at Natagera, beautiful, beautiful site, or beautiful village over here. And then we went back to Pharaoh 2, where Davenport and Roger Green had found a small amount, I mean, literally a handful of plain sherds here. I managed to redate this ceramic, but in our survey, and we did quite a bit more survey throughout this region and excavation here in this rock shelter, we found no more ceramic. There's no Lapita. And we had lots of experience, of course, with the intertidal sites at this time. So even in the intertidal, we couldn't see any evidence of Lapita here. So again, I was fairly confident that there really was a Lapita ceramic in this region. And of course, if you look out from the far end of, here's a shot looking south from the south coast of Santa Ana. And that's just, you know, nonstop between here and Australia. There's nothing out there. Now, Santa Ana is due west of Santa Cruz. And so people in Santa Cruz have a lot of tradition about drifting or being rescued by people in Santa Ana, because they called Santa Ana the island of women, because they got good reception there and eventually managed to find their way back home. If they didn't hit Santa Ana, they called this the seas of no return. This is where people drifted and never were seen again. And so it seems quite reasonable to me that some of this small amount of plainware pottery came from Santa Ana or Santa Cruz at some point back, as we say, sort of at the late Lapita time period. Still no real evidence of ceramics in Eastern Solomons. And that colleagues from Australia also went and worked in Makira. German colleagues worked in Malaita. And everyone, of course, initially was, well, we'll go and find the Lapita ceramics that Peter can't find. And none of them have found anything. There is no ceramics in the Eastern Solomons. So I'm quite happy that there is that leapfrog movement, which is a pretty extraordinary one, because the assumption was that Roger Green and everyone had was that there would be a systematic wave of advance from the Bismarck Archipelago all the way down along the chain of islands, of Solomon Islands, and then on out into remote Oceania. And so the people in Santa Cruz should be most closely related to the people in the Eastern Solomons, which the linguists could tell them they're not, but anyhow. So this leapfrog was pretty radical. The other thing, of course, then I said, well, I would really like to see these real Lapita sites. Everyone tells me that, you know, we don't know how to find them. But I would like to see areas where they're obviously found. And so we returned to Santa Cruz in 2012, and we went specifically back to this site SZ8, which was the oldest, supposedly the oldest site. But the problem there with the dating was there was no charcoal. There was only shell dating, which are a bit problematic. And, you know, being, well, in the time when Roger went back in the 70s, of course, you needed like 10 grams of sample. Well, we just thought, well, there was obviously charcoal, but Roger wasn't collecting it. So actually, we found out that there wasn't any charcoal, but anyhow. We went back there. There you can see the village in Nangu, and dance circles, very famous, culturally quite different from its neighbors to the east, but anyhow. Well, there's SZ8. It's about 400 meters back of the beach at the main village. And here's this lagoon. When the site was occupied, that lagoon would come in right in here. So its position today is sort of in the back in the middle of the bush, but it was right beside the lagoon then. And we went, there's the beautiful coast. I like this picture for one reason, that when I was, most of the time I was working in the Solomons, you want to communicate with people, you communicated by radio. And various times I came out to find major transformations that happened in my my family. But people could get in touch with me. But this, for the first time, I was able to go down to the beach and use my mobile phone and phone home, which was pretty special for my wife and family and all those people for all these years, of course, who've been staying at home, wondering what in the hell I was doing up in the Solomon Islands. And so we were able to do that. There's no roads there, there's no power there, but they got cell phones everywhere in the Solomons these days. And they got means of charging them and means of getting credit and all kinds of things. Anyhow, we went back first off to find Roger's site, and I think that tree back there was on Roger's map. It's dead now, but it was on Roger's map, or at least they argued, and you can see Lapita ceramics in the gardens around there. We re-excavated there. We found that yes, there was virtually no charcoal, but we managed to find little bits. I mean, today, of course, we can date micrograms of charcoal, and we found bits of charcoal underneath sherds lying on, the original surface. So you're very careful. You can get some charcoal that had been saved by that microenvironment. And also we found charcoal, which we excavated out of shells, so we can calibrate the shell dates with the charcoal date. So we improved the dating. And, your textbooks will all say 3,200. Well, in fact, it's not more than 3,000. And that is, I will argue, is the date of the settlement of remote Oceania. That's the earliest site. So in 2012, we have good evidence for late expansion into the Western Solomons, and also surprisingly at that time along the south coast of Papua New Guinea. There was no evidence for Lapita in the Eastern Solomons, despite the work of, as I said, my work on Santa Ana, people's work on Makira and Malaita. And the dating of settlement of remote Oceania was reduced to just post 3000 calibrated BP using Bayesian statistics, which gave more time for the development of Lapita up in the Bismarck Archipelago before the movement out. And also at that, we just had got many more sites in remote Oceania, including the first Lapita cemetery in Vanuatu, down here in the Fate Island outside of Port Vila, a site called Tayuma. This site was found initially by people excavating for a shrimp farm. Unfortunately, they recognized that they were onto something there and brought in the archaeologists, the Vanuatu Cultural Center people, and my good friends Matthew Spriggs and former student Stuart Bedford, with Spriggs doing the supervising and Stuart doing all the work. But anyhow, we didn't have any real Lapita cemeteries, hardly any definite Lapita skeletal material prior to this. But here we get lots of burials, very elaborate treatment of the dead placed in pots, and association between pots and people is stronger. Here you can see more of those face motifs on the pottery, all different kinds. Here's one here, but also here's one here. There's the eyes, there's the nose, and so on, more down here. Very elaborate pottery. That's half of Peter White's head. Some of you might know of Peter White, very famous Australian archaeologist. There he is looking out. Tayuma's down here, sort of inland today. Sea levels have changed. We're standing up on a bluff looking over where Tayuma is. Now, what was still existing problem was this problem of explaining migration, genetic diversity, essentially. Because obviously there are different people with different genetic backgrounds, genetic heritage, from very dark-skinned people, Melanesia out into the Polynesian. What's going on there? How do we explain that? And the people were typically talking about Papuan versus Asian genes. And so the idea was that these Lapita people were Austronesian speakers, ultimately rapidly moved down from a place like Taiwan through island Southeast Asia and on out into the Pacific. But of course, I mean, today populations are quite mixed, and it's quite normal for people who are Austronesian speakers to marry people who are Papuan speakers and so on. And there's a lot of genetic, intermixing and linguistic intermixing, and so it's a complicated world. So people like me just thought, well, that's the way it was in Lapita times as well. But then how do you account for the very distinctive Polynesian phenotype out in remote Oceania? So then, the suggestion was always, well, there must be some genetic bottlenecking at some time. Some small part of that phenotype, which had the Polynesian characteristics, got separated from everything else. But of course, it was a time when people were sailing all over the place. So this is the high mobility. How do you get bottlenecking in the situation of mobility? And unfortunately, of course, there was always this association of languages with genes, because out in remote Oceania, everyone spoke Austronesian languages. Of course, not everyone out there looked the same. So that made it a bit more difficult. But we'll see the geneticists always like to equate genes and language. So here we see stallholders at the Honiara Central Market. And if you were to look, you would see dark faces, and they or their parents are from the Western Solomons, very likely, and lighter faces, they're from the Eastern Solomons. You look closely, you would see some people who are Micronesians, and they're descendants of people who were brought in the 60s from Micronesia by the British government. And you would see Polynesian people who are from the Polynesian outliers, which are part of the Solomon Islands. The westernmost Polynesian people. And so all that diversity, how do we explain all that as well? Still. And so, of course, the linguists or the geneticists got into the act. And initially, of course, they're studying modern DNA. Initially looking at mitochondrial DNA, which is, as you all know, comes down through the female line. And what they found was that there was one haplogroup of mitochondrial DNA, B4A1A1, which was characteristic of Polynesian people. And here you can see, here are the East Polynesian samples from Tonga, New Zealand, and the pink or the red is the amount of this particular haplogroup. And so you can see it's very distinctive of Polynesia. You come over here into Vanuatu, the white you can sort of say is Papuan kind of genetics. And here, central highlands of Papua New Guinea, none of this. On the coast populations, we get some of this Polynesian haplogroup, and we get it all the way back up here into Taiwan. And so again, if there's a link, somehow we just have to get this population down through here and then get it bottlenecked somehow, and we've got Polynesia. And as I said to you, in 2015, if you asked me, I would have said, well, very likely the Lapita people spoke multiple languages, not just Austronesian languages, that genetically they were quite diverse as people in the Bismarck Archipelago are today. Everyone's intermarried with everyone else. It's quite diverse, and that's the way the world would have been in Lapita times. Because I found it very difficult to think that there was why would there be two migrations? That just seems so odd. So what they found, I mean, they've been trying to get DNA out of this skeletal material from Tauma for some time, but it was only when they found that they could get DNA, good DNA, out of the petrous bones from the ear. Petrous bone is very, very hard. And it was that which they were successful in getting DNA, whole genome-wide sequence. So for the first time, we had Lapita DNA. And here it is. Here's modern. Everything else here you see is modern. Here's East Asian samples, remote Oceania. So that's sort of, the end of the Solomons out into the Pacific. Near Oceania, Bismarck Archipelago, Vanuatu, and so on. And Lapita doesn't look like anyone. it looks closest to the East Asian, actually the Philippines, some samples from the Philippines, but still separate, different. And these are 3 of the samples from Tayuma. And so you might say, oh, well, they're all probably just brothers and sisters. Oh, actually, they're all women, but they're probably all sisters. But the other one is from Tonga. They're all very early Lapita and all very genetically tight. And so, newsflash, looks like the population moved down quite rapidly through Melanesia out into remote Oceania without much interbreeding, and that's the origins ultimately of people of remote Oceania and Polynesia. I find it personally a bit odd that they're so tight when the other samples here are quite diverse. Of course, that fired up all the geneticists, so no skeleton in the Pacific was safe. So all the archaeologists were hit up for samples from throughout the Pacific. In 2018, we get 19 South-Pacific individuals described. And from this data, because now it's not just Lapita, they got Lapita at the oldest end, and then they got samples that come all the way through back into the last few hundred years. And so they have a time slice of 19 samples. And what they find is that around 2,500 years ago, suddenly we start to see more and more of these so-called Papuan genes in the Pacific. And therefore, in this case, they get really wound up about, they're saying, well, all these Papuan people came and they must have spoken Papuan languages. Well, that's not necessarily true, but there is no relationship necessarily between language and genetics. But anyhow, and that they dropped their language and didn't replace the Austronesian language, but genetically they replaced the genes, especially in places like Vanuatu, New Caledonia. So that explains those dark people from Melanesia, island Melanesia, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji. So here's a blow up of that particular shot. So, and for me, I mean, back in the early one, 2016, one of their conclusions, of course, was, well, there is no evidence of mixture with Solomon Islands, and therefore Peter Sheppard is correct, which made me happy. And then this one even more, so they say there's no evidence. So what you see here, here's some more Lapita samples they have. They're still pretty tight up here. But then these are all the different samples, and over time, the time sequence here, they become more like modern PNG, but modern Vanuatu samples. The Vanuatu samples are down in here. And so there is a second movement. Now, whether I would think that it's probably just a steady stream of people. They're also not, these are the Solomon Islands up here. They're not coming out of the Solomons. They're most closely, if you look closely at this data, here's the Santa Cruz samples. They're most like people from New Britain, the Bismarck Archipelago. So it's like a repeat of the leapfrog all the way out here. So here's the blow up of that particular thing. So here's Santa Cruz samples in here. These are modern Vanuatu, Ni Vanuatu samples. And here you can see the archaeological samples gradually looking more and more like modern populations. So Lapita are unlike any modern populations, but closest to modern populations in the Philippines. Polynesian people have considerable Polynesian motif, mitochondrial DNA, which is found in all Lapita remains. If you look at the mitochondrial DNA. Modern populations in remote Oceania have various amounts of, quote, Papuan ancestry introduced after early Lapita. And of course, so over time, we get admixture of near Oceanian genes into remote Oceania, which creates the situation today of most distant Polynesia. Looks very distinctive when you get to a place like Fiji. People always have difficulty. Is it part of West Polynesia? Is it part of Melanesia? It's sort of a halfway point. But this stream of genetic material down over time into remote Oceania from places like the Bismarck Archipelago accounts for what we see today in genetic terms out in the Pacific. So we've got this Lapita leapfrog expansion around 3,000 calibrated BP. And then we have this movement. And again, I should make this a leapfrog curve because if there's no, I mean, the movement out of here accounts for what we see. The intertidal ceramics we have here ties right back up into this part of the world. And so there is a movement, in this time period into the Solomons, but a distinct one, almost again another leapfrog out into here, then which gets shared out through this greater region here. So you asking me at this stage, if you're still awake, what about East Polynesia and Micronesia, where we started? And I have to say, that you'd have to be here for another hour and you'd probably all be sleeping if I was to give you I'm working on this at the moment, writing on this at the moment. And so, as I say, it'd be another hour giving you all the details of this. But what I have concluded is that what we see is, so we got Lapita people moving out into this part of the world, Samoa, Tonga. Around 2,500, 2,000 BP, there's a back movement. I mean, if you can sail out here, you can sail back. And so we see just a steady stream, I think, from this time period of Lapita people moving back here, interacting with populations back here. And this is a Tongan canoe that Captain Cook saw in 1774. These big double-hull canoes. These people are sailing back and forth here quite regularly and bringing their Polynesian sort of genetics with them. They interact here and they settle these tiny little islands off the Solomons, which are called Polynesian outliers. These are Polynesian people, speak Polynesian languages, and genetically look different than the people, for the most part, the people in the main Solomon Islands. Then about 2,000 years ago, they move up north of the equator into Eastern Micronesia. And that's the settlement of Eastern Micronesia around 2,000 years ago out of this interaction sphere through here. And then around 1,000, we know now, around 1,000 calibrated BP, they moved across the top of this region into East Polynesia and eventually as far as Hawaii and New Zealand and so on. Late in the sequence. So there's highly mobile people throughout this time period eventually creating. And you look at the material, there's lots of evidence. I can't go into it here, but it's linguistic as well as material culture and archaeological evidence for this particular. So here's the general idea again. East Polynesian settlement around 1,000. Here's you can see the outliers here, the Polynesian outliers, these tiny columns of Polynesia here. And this East Micronesian settlement around 2,000 years ago. So we're back to Peter Buck, back to Vikings of the Sunrise. And so as Terrain Hiroa proposed in 1938, we have a southern movement of bringing food, plants, and animals into West Polynesia. This is the initial Lapita expansion into island Melanesia and West Polynesia, where they stopped for 2,000 years. We have a northern movement of Polynesian ancestors from Micronesia into East Polynesia. That was Peter Buck's idea. What we have now, and what I think I've got pretty good evidence for, is early back movement into the outlier Micronesian interaction sphere, which resulted ultimately in the development of proto-East Polynesian culture, because that was a thing that wasn't possible with the models that had derived East Polynesia, this very united cultural sort of framework. You couldn't easily derive it out of West Polynesia unless you had some place for it to develop. And it developed, as linguists would argue, and I would argue, in this outlier Micronesian interaction sphere, and then settled around 1,000 BP over into East Polynesia, and eventually down to New Zealand. So I'd just like to thank you and my many Solomon Island friends and colleagues. There's my old friend, John Kiopo, who is, or was, unfortunately he died a few years ago, was the chief archaeologist at the Solomon Island National Museum, but was from the Lontong Java, one of those Polynesian outliers that we're just talking about, along with a couple of my friends from Santa Cruz. So, Lianahola, thank you very much.